strategic inflection points.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Shoot first, ask questions later, charging into policy risk and uncertainty. International trade developed organically as certain territories found they could supply consumer demand in other regions. International trade policy, when it finally appeared, was based on maximizing a country's wealth. City-states, regions, and countries developed practices to maximize exports and precious metals while minimizing imports. As most economic activity during this era involved agriculture and precious metals, countries sought to control more productive land, silver, and gold. These beggar-thy-neighbor policies often went hand in hand with imperial conquest, domination, and war. The policy name for this practice is mercantilism. Beggar thy neighbor was the order of the day, and imperial conquest was the standard. Around 1800, Adam Smith and David Ricardo advocated policies that minimized government involvement in the economy. This gave more latitude to private business and entrepreneurs. David Ricardo, in particular, thought countries should produce goods and services in which they had a competitive advantage. By lowering trade barriers and allowing each nation to produce in industries where they had natural advantages, living standards could be raised for all. An example of a competitive advantage would be the productive land to grow coffee beans found in Brazil, Colombia, and Nicaragua. While his thoughts eventually gained traction in Western Europe, imperial conquest continued. Since the Civil War, international commerce increased significantly as industrialization spread. While this was interrupted by the First World War, it decreased by more than 60% after the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. This, according to Stephen Roach, who served as chief economist for Morgan Stanley. After World War II, the U.S. and other victors created the international system of trading called the Bretton Woods Agreement. This process included the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. The mission of the GATT was to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers in international trade and investment. This was the U.S. creating the world in its own image. The U.S. and Great Britain created the GATT with the goal of spreading peace and prosperity internationally. While the goal was public-spirited, it originated in self-interest. The U.S. and Great Britain advocated the GATT because they stood to benefit the most. At the time, Washington's rivals were dead in the water. The scorched earth bombing of World War II leveled the Eurasian continent and Japan. The U.S. hoped the Marshall Act would get the Allies on their feet again, and eventually they would become happy, free-trading capitalists. This allowed the U.S. to become the world's largest exporter after World War II. The ideas of Smith and Ricardo became international policy, which some labeled the Washington Consensus. Wealth and incomes grew in the Western world. Free trade expanded internationally and regionally in blocs like the European Union, NAFTA, and Mercosur. In the 1970s, wealth and income disparities grew in the West, creating definite winners and losers in the globalizing economy. These disparities initially mirrored educational differences, but evolved into stagnant wealth favoritism and class warfare. As the wealth of U.S. allies grew in Japan and Europe, the U.S. became restless as the leader of expanded globalization. As China's economic fortunes expanded through their unfair trade practices, calls for retaliation and redress reached a fever pitch. This growing resistance led to the elections of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The post-World War II international trade system went into reverse as countries like the UK left the Union of Free Trading Countries in the EU, and Venezuela was suspended from Mercosur. Barriers to international trade and investment increased in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Reshoring, friendshoring, resource nationalism, and export bans emerged and expanded. The growing international consensus of less free trade and investment has spread. As more of the world moves in this direction, competitive advantage will decline and economies of scale will disappear. In a beggar thy neighbor world, each country looks out for itself exclusively. As this sentiment grows, U.S. exports will decline and the cost of U.S. imports will increase. How will this show up economically? In the short term, tariffs will increase chaos for consumers. In the long run, tariffs will impact producers. As tariffs and tariff concerns grow, investors will cut back on production, incomes will decrease, and unemployment will rise. Mass manufacturing requires patient investors who know their investments will lose money until they can ramp up production effectively to benefit from economies of scale. It may have cost $50 million to produce the first Model T Ford, but the 5,000th car could be made for less than $1,000. Not surprisingly, U.S. investments in manufacturing have been declining since last year. Construction of manufacturing facilities like assembly lines for washing machines started declining in October of last year. This is when it became apparent that Donald Trump would be the next president. Do investors and corporate executives have Trump derangement syndrome? It's more likely that they are worried about policy risk. This has manifested in President Trump's tariffs announcements and reversals. The president uses policy announcements and surprises to keep U.S. competitors off balance. For the long-term investor laying out billions of dollars for returns that will only show up in 3 to 5 years, the growing policy risk and uncertainty is unnerving. While risk can theoretically be measured, uncertainty cannot. It injects a massive element of risk into the system. In the heat of the new tariff announcements, economist Noah Smith said small business investment plans are crashing and manufacturers are crashing hard. Smith explained the stock market can take the long view. Those who anticipate supply shocks induced by tariffs could cause a demand shock. This is when buyers, be they consumers or corporations, go on strike. The conservative American Enterprise Institute wrote, Trump also seems blind to the idea that markets and economic agents abhor uncertainty. A survey of U.S. chief investment officers found their opinion on the current business conditions is at its lowest it's been since the beginning of the pandemic in spring of 2020. The Dallas Federal Reserve reported that uncertainty is leading to less investment in energy production. One executive called uncertainty the key word to describe 2025 and added, our investors, quote, hate uncertainty. Economist Stephen Roach stated uncertainty is the enemy of decision making. He warned businesses when faced with uncertainty will not make the big fixed cost decisions to expand plants and engage in construction of new facilities to expand our productive capacity. The U.S. is not in a recession yet, but continued uncertainty, combined with less consumer spending and business spending, will lead us into one. If the Trump-pledged tariffs are actually implemented by the U.S. and its trading partners retaliate as promised, long-term investments can decline further and layoffs could expand. Hopefully, cooler heads will prevail.